Welcome to the Beyond Atheism podcast, with me, Nathan Alexander, and my co-host, Todd Tavares. Moving beyond questions of God's existence, this podcast asks, what's next in a world without God? If you're enjoying the show so far, make sure to like and subscribe, rate and review, and consider supporting us on Patreon.
In previous episodes, we've explored the sources of human morality and whether atheists, or rather why atheists, can be moral. But in the absence of a God to author moral absolutes, secular societies are left in a quandary with few, if any, certainties. Are moral values universally true, or are they only true in particular times and places? Are morals completely rigid, or are they flexible based on the consequences of immoral actions? Can we be morally strict and relativist at the same time? To explore these issues, we're joined by Aaron Rabinowitz, a PhD student in the Rutgers Graduate School of Education and the host of not one, but two philosophy podcasts, Embrace the Void and Philosophers in Space. Aaron is also running a 3-week workshop in January through the Inner Work Center called Morality Without God. Aaron, welcome to Beyond Atheism.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron, for coming on. We're talking about morality today. So just to kind of get us started, are humans moral animals? And how do we know if so?
Yeah, so I think we're definitely animals, and I think we can act morally and we can think about morality. So I think we meet both of the criteria. I think we are lucky enough to be evolved in the kinds of ways that are necessary for an entity to understand and think about moral responsibility and act based on that thinking. And so I think it means we have an obligation to do so.
So how is that different from like animals that are completely immoral? Or are animals completely immoral?
Yeah, so I would probably end up using the term amoral,
Right.
but
Yeah.
like
Right.
in the sense that like, and this it can get a little weird. Like, there's when you sort of laid out those kinds of questions at the beginning, right? There are actually like 7 different sort of axes of what do we mean when we're talking about morality. Like, do we mean universal? Do we mean objective? What do we mean by the source? What do we mean by our access? All of these could be different like questions in a sense. So when it comes to us versus other animals, right? Like, I think it's immoral for a lion to eat a small human child, right? Like, in the sense that like it causes moral harms and it would be better that they not do that, right? Do they have the ability to understand that moral obligation? No. And like, we can't try to train them to understand it because they're not capable of doing so, but it's immoral for them to do it. And the reason that I think that even though like I think they are amoral in terms of their responsibility, I don't think there's really a fundamental difference between them and something like a thoroughgoing human sociopath, someone who really, truly, genuinely doesn't understand morality. And there are like different ways of understanding like how that works in terms of empathy deficits, or callousness, or physical defects or something like that. But like whatever that cashes out to, it seems quite plausible to me that there can be a human being who doesn't understand moral responsibility, and we wouldn't then say it's like no longer immoral for them to kill a bunch of people just because they don't understand their obligation.
So it sounds like when we start looking at moral frameworks, we need to have, there are a few components that you've already touched on. We need to know that there's a difference between right and wrong, and that we have an obligation to act, to not do wrong. I think, is that fair to say if we're thinking about what morality means?
Yes, there's a couple of different ways that people have tried to cash out, just generally speaking, what the word morality means. So one of them is this like right and wrong, obligations, duties, that kind of thing. This is most commonly associated with the term deontology, which nowadays broadly means like non-consequentialism, commonly associated with folks like Kant, father of critical race theory.
Right. Yes.
Versus there are other things like the conception of morality that is about maximizing the good or producing the most good, which is different in some ways, though it can also intersect. Like, all of these things will, I think, in many ways converge. All the moral theories, I think, try to cover the same ground intuitively while justifying their own interpretation. But so, like, there is, I think, a difference between focusing on right and wrong versus focusing on good and bad, which can, most commonly comes out in terms of like reducing suffering and things like that. And then there's like a third, at least one other model, like, but maybe let's say two other models, right? There's the virtue theory model, which says that morality is really about maximizing flourishing, and not necessarily maximizing, but like producing human flourishing, right? Bringing about the what's necessary for humans to flourish, which involves, probably a mix of the other two things that we were just talking about. And then like a fourth one, I think, would be something like the care ethics model or compassion based ethics, which says that ethics is about cultivating care and compassion because we are, capable as human beings of being compassionate, and that compassion is central to the good life for human beings. Therefore, that is fundamental to what it is to be ethical for humans.
And which of these do you subscribe to? Or which do you think is best and why?
All of them.
I should have known.
I'm what's called a pluralist, in the sense I think that these are all moral theories that have stood the test of time in this kind of way. I think tend to capture at least one key moral intuition. Like, for example, deontology captures how much we value the autonomy of individuals who can have agency, and we value it sort of intrinsically, in a sense where we don't want to put a price tag on the value of human freedom such that it could be traded off for any amount of utility or something like that, right?
But
And then you have another
wait,
foundation.
just for clarification, deontology, you're talking about like very clear right and wrong, moral absolutes, correct?
Yeah, potentially, right. Usually it comes out in the form of rules, like, the classic version is the Kantian never act in a way, never act according to a maxim that you couldn't universalize as like the universal law for all people or something like that, right? But you could also have like milder versions of deontology that are just like, we should put a very, very high, limit on violating freedom or autonomy or something like that. These are extremely, extremely valuable or something, right? So where I end up is, I think that you can't get rid of any one of these views. You have to balance them through the kind of practical reasoning that the virtue theorists support, and that, like, all we are doing in our lives when we're doing ethics is trying to be as sensitive to as many of these ethical factors as possible, and then make the best choice we can, and like hope that we've done the right thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that makes sense, actually, to just sort of view them as not necessarily in conflict, but perhaps like complementary or something.
Yeah, I mean, I can throw around technical terms. They're irreducible, competing ethical foundations, right? They are what we call pro tanto moral
Okay.
claims, which is to say, this is a little
Uh-huh.
important, right?
Uh-huh.
Because
Uh-huh.
what we want to say is, all things being equal, for example, one ought not to cause unnecessary suffering. And there's a lot of key words in there that you got to cash out. But the all things being equal at the beginning tells us none of these things is true in every situation in a, like, this one is dominant kind of way, right? They all are in tension, and they all can at some point be subsumed, be swamped by other moral concerns, I think.
Mm-hmm. But I wanted to ask, like, for particular moral questions, like, I guess this is getting to the question of like whether there's kind of objectively correct answers to moral questions.
Hmm.
Um, and yes, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's the right question, and I think the answer is yes. And like, so this puts me in the camp of the moral realists, right? I think there are objective moral truths, and that we can gain knowledge about them. And like, what we mean by objective, obviously, is a lot hangs on that. um I define objective following the work of a guy named Schaefer Landau, who says that, like, morality is moral claim is objective when it is stance independent or belief independent. Now, we want to be really careful here, right? So what we mean is, let's say, take an example of slavery, right? Is slavery immoral? I would say slavery is immoral independent of anybody's beliefs about the morality of slavery, right? It could be the case that everybody on this planet, everybody in the universe, God itself, believes that slavery is immoral or is moral, right? And they're all wrong, right? On my view, they're all wrong. That to me is what objective means. So that is different. It's an important distinction to make between that and like how you feel about things may impact moral judgments, right? Like if you really enjoy a particular activity, then encouraging you to, or, pushing you to do that activity is not a bad thing or something like that, right? So like your psychological states, some of your beliefs can have impact on what is moral or immoral for you or about you or things like that. But it isn't your moral judgments about what is right or wrong that determines what is right or wrong, if that makes sense.
But when it's objective, does it
Mhm.
exist outside of the self? Meaning, is there like,
Right.
is it not even written on a stone somewhere? Is it like measurable or quantifiable or something that we can definitively point to and say like, oh, here it is. This is how we know that this is wrong. This is how we know slavery is wrong.
Yeah, so there's a couple of different things in there, right? They are, the moral truths to me are outside of our minds in the sense that the speed of light is outside of our minds, right? That it's a feature of the universe that we are describing through these claims, right? The descriptions exist in our minds, right? You could argue in that sense, but like I think what you're asking is there some, like are there moral truths that are out there that even if everybody didn't know about them, they would still be true or something, like scientific claims? And I think the answer is yes. The tricky part is they can't be measured like scientific things, right? Like you can't build a machine to measure whether slavery is immoral the way you can build a machine to measure whether the speed of light is X, Y, or Z. The British tried really hard. They really did, I think, try to build a machine that effectively tested the question, is slavery immoral? And I think the answer was yes, right? But like, it doesn't work in the same exact kind of way, right? What you have to do is you have to look at the harms or benefits. You have to weigh those in like a fashion that will ultimately be intuitive. So I should acknowledge that like part of my moral realism is a kind of what's called intuitionism. I think that morality fundamentally rests on intuitions. It can't rest on something else. There's no other data available to us to do the work that they do, which some people really don't like, but I think is fundamentally unavoidable. And we should just bite that bullet and acknowledge that reality and then do our best to like bootstrap our intuitions into being more ethical, essentially.
Mm. That sounds almost experiential in a sense, meaning like it wasn't that there was an experiment. In some ways, we can say there's been a grand experiment around things like slavery, about women's rights, about racism, and the intuition that we've come away from these experiences that have lasted thousands of years in some cases is that it was all wrong. Is that a fair summation of this?
So where science and experiments and experience, right? Experiments and experience fit into this is on the side of, primarily on the side of answering questions like, does slavery cause suffering, right? Which like seems an obviously answered question, but there was a debate about this, right? Where people were like, actually it's good. And like there was an article that came out this week where someone's like, actually Reconstruction was bad, right? Like, so these are unfortunately live debates, right? But we can assess the amount of harm and suffering that they cause in like variously kinds of quantifiable ways. And you can build machines, you can build algorithms to measure that sort of stuff, right? What you can't measure is, what is the moral value of that suffering, right? How many utils or something like, utilitarians try this at one point, right? Like they tried to sort of come up with literal utilitarian calculuses to try to like measure right and wrong, but like it just is not going to work that way. It's not that sort of thing. So you can't measure on the normative side of the equation. You can measure, like, does forcing people not to be gay cause a lot of suffering? yes, right? Like that's a testable question. But like, is it immoral to prevent them from being gay? That has in part an intuitive component that says there's nothing that's worth forcing someone to be gay. There's no trade-off that like makes this ethically justifiable.
Hmm. One thing I was just saying to Todd at the start, like, or I mean, before you got here, just that, like, I'm not really sure, but I think I sort of lean more towards the moral relativist side. But I'm sort of, yeah, not exactly sure how I feel. But I do feel like, if there were a God, like, the question would be a lot easier. I mean, in that, or if there was a God who sort of obviously just sort of laid out objective rules for us to follow. But I mean, I think we all agree that that isn't the case, and so that makes things more difficult, I think, for atheists.
So I actually go in the other direction at this point. I
Okay.
feel like if God exists, it makes everything sort of worse in a sense.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Because, so like, depending on what we mean by God here, right? But if we mean the Christian omniscient, omnipresent, you know, uh, um, source of normativity, right? The God is the decider on what is moral or immoral, then I don't think we have a realist universe, right? Like our universe is fundamentally morally governed by the subjective will of a
Mm.
Yeah.
tyrant,
Right.
which
Yeah.
Yes.
seems bad to me, right? It
Yeah.
seems very, very bad to me because, like, fundamentally, I don't think there's an answer to the question, why couldn't God make, you know, it moral to torture people or something
Right.
like that? And that would be a bad universe to live in. So, but I don't think that that's the way it actually works. And like, I'm very sympathetic to the Euthyphro as a counter argument to, um, claims by Christians that you need God as a source of normativity. I think quite the opposite, that like, um, you're much better off without God when you're trying to answer the question, is something good because God says it's good, or is it good because God, recognizes that it's good, right? Like, I think it's fine to be religious, but I think hopefully you want to come to the conclusion that even God couldn't make slavery moral. And like that means that slavery exists above and beyond God's will, even if he is a perfect observer of its, true nature.
Mm.
Mm.
Yeah, like when I hear about things like in objective morality, to bring God
Mm-hmm.
back into it, if we must. One of the things that like I kind of get defensive about with claims for objective morality is that
Mm-hmm.
the religious claim is always that, well, God is the author, right? It's God. We get it from God. We
Mm-hmm.
get our morality from God. And even if we start to move that focus, right, whether it's to intersubjectivity, right? Like we learn morality from each other. We learn it from being part of the universe. We learn it from our intuition. That the thing that I predict happens is that
Mm-hmm.
God itself is shifted, right? Or like, well, you have that intuition because that's God speaking through you, or God gives humans intuition so they know right from wrong, and therefore we should always do right. Does your sense of objective morality do anything to alter claims, or is it dependent on claims of the existence of a divine power? Does that matter at all? Is it disruptive to that idea?
I do think it is disruptive to it because it provides an alternative account to like God being the source. So like, there are a couple questions to distinguish here between, right? We want to distinguish between how do we as human beings gain access to moral knowledge and
Mm-hmm.
moral truths,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
from the question of what grounds those claims, right? What makes it the case that something is right or wrong or something like that, right? Moral claims to me are grounded fundamentally in the nature of the universe, in the sense that, like, if you understand suffering, right? If you understand what a conscious being is, and you understand what suffering is and what it is to experience suffering, then you fundamentally, I think, will understand why it is pro tanto immoral to cause unnecessary suffering to a conscious being, right? Like, it necessarily, to me, follows from the nature of those things. That's, to me, is what grounds moral claims. And there are lots of different versions of that for the different foundations. And then how we gain access to that is a mix, the same way we gain access to our I don't want to say the exact same way, but similar in a bootstrapping sense in the way that we gain access to things like statistical knowledge. So as evolved creatures, our statistical understanding is poor, right? Like we're very bad at statistics. That's why we are easy marks for gambling and things like that, right? But we get better as a species at statistical reasoning by thinking about it, by doing a bunch of work, etc., by using a mix of the reasoning skills that we did have from evolution to sort of bootstrap up our understanding. Similarly, I think with morality, what happens is we have these evolutionary pro-social adaptations, like a sense of fairness and a sense of compassion or empathy, and those abilities combined with our reasoning allows us to take the fairly mixed bag of like moral impulses that I think we have evolved as human beings and make them better, right? Like figure out that like even if I feel like it's okay for me to like go out and murder the person who has wronged me, that like that's not actually the right way to deal with a situation or something, right? So that is the way that I think we gain access to the knowledge, and none of that requires God. Like
Right.
at no point
Yeah.
in any of that
Mhm.
do we need to appeal to a divine or even like a telos for evolution or something like that, right? Like this is a completely non-teleological account of the origin of moral understanding. And I think we just happen to be lucky enough as human beings to be able to gain access to the moral foundations that you and I have that we've all talked about here, and that I think we all understand, and that we can make correct inferences from.
Yeah.
Yeah, one thing just that I was thinking about, like as you were talking about, I mean, do you think that we improve in our moral knowledge, like over human history? I mean, do we learn more? I mean, in the same sense, I feel like, I mean, I think it's sort of somewhat controversial to say, but I do think like we learn more about nature. I mean, like I think like our scientific understanding of the world has improved. Like it's not just different. It's not just different stuff. We're actually learning more.
Mhm.
But do you think it's the same with morality?
Yeah, so I want to, like, I hope it is,
Mhm.
right? I don't feel all the time confident. So I have this thing that I always think about when it comes to these progress questions, this kind of paradox of progress idea, where it feels at one point obvious to me that we have made moral progress in terms of our understanding and in terms of our societies. And at the same time I'm like, but have we?
Right.
Like,
Uh-huh.
you know, like so take gay marriage or homosexuality for example, or something like that, right? Like in one sense America has gotten better in that we have rapidly improved how people sort of view gay people, the acceptance of gay marriage and things like that. So that seems like a concrete case of progress, right? But are we substantially farther along on this than like Greece or something like that? Like there I think it becomes more complicated. And then when you look at things like slavery, right, where yes, we abolish the Atlantic slave trade, but then we reproduce it in the form of criminal prison labor, in the form of exported labor in foreign countries
Right.
and things like
Yeah.
that. So
Mhm.
it's just like, are we actually making progress, or is liberalism and progressivism telling itself that it's making progress while it's just sort of rebranding and repackaging every new generation of suffering? I don't know the full answer to that question. Like, I do think we get better. I do think that that more people today care about morality and try to generally do better. But like it's hard, and like we're all I think burned out from feeling so much moral responsibility all the time that like I wouldn't stake money on any claim that like human beings on average are more ethical today than they were 1,000 years ago or
Right.
something like
Mm,
that.
Yeah.
yeah. But I mean, especially since you brought up gambling again, that you wouldn't stake money on people being more moral. It kind of
Yeah.
that brings back another loop that I'd been thinking about, and I found myself I wanted to dig into a little more because the way you talked about it with statistics is like we know more about statistics, right? This collectively, and I think we
Hmm.
can kind of say this morally too, right? Like we collectively know now about the
Hmm.
implications of slavery. We know that it's wrong. We know why it's wrong. And this comes from presumably like individuals add to this collective knowledge,
Mm-hmm.
right? The same way that we build knowledge of statistics, and then this knowledge about statistics filters down and it affects how people gamble or if they gamble, right? And I
Right.
assume there's something that like this metaphor seems to hold, or maybe I should ask it as a question. Does this metaphor hold this idea that we build these individual experiences, turn it into collective information, and then it becomes part of our individual morality? Or is there another sort of transmission belt? Is there a way that our understanding of the universe becomes the morality and that becomes the personal rules that guide us?
I mean, I think there's a feedback loop there, I think, between sort of social situations and individuals and individual behavior, right? So we can point to Kant and say, the formulation of the categorical imperative in the form of, treat others as ends in themselves, not as mere means to an end, right? Like that is a important, meaningful formulation that like inspires all sorts of thinking, that these sorts of things inspire people like John Rawls to bring about like theories of justice that then have applied implications and people change their behavior, and this trickles down into improvements in quality of life for people. I think that happens sometimes. I certainly don't want to overstate the amount to which it actually happens, but I do think that like ideas have to be coalesced by individuals or groups of individuals and put forward and argued for, and like things like the social contract don't just kind of invent themselves, right? They have to be constructed in these kinds of ways.
They also have
So yeah.
institutions attached to them, and I'm curious if you've like in when you think this out, are there institutions that help contribute to this feedback loop?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, so like you can have a really messy conversation, right, about like what is the institution of religion's role in moral progress,
Yeah.
Right. Yes.
right? Like,
Yeah.
and the answer is both and not great, right? Like, yes, it's true that like Christians play an important role in, like Christianity heavily motivates some people to engage in the civil rights movement, right? But Christianity also encourages people to engage in some of the worst forms of colonial settler violence possible, right? So it's like, yeah, institutions help too, right? These things sort of feedback into each other. Another example would be folks like Peter Singer and the recently departed Bernie Rollins, who these folks who did work in the applied area of animal welfare, right, or animal rights or something like that, where you take these ideas about civil rights and you apply them to animals and you genuinely improve the quality of life by changing approaches. Now, we still have a bunch of factory farming, so there's that paradox of progress again, but like, people like Temple Grandin and stuff, like I do think there is a sense in which these individuals do make a difference, right? So I don't think it's that like that stuff doesn't matter at all, but it's also the reality that like things change when the material conditions make it possible for them to change, and when they don't, people invent philosophies to rationalize the status quo.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, is there any like agonism in this? Is it driven by conflict or is it driven by um I don't know what the alternative would be. Synthesis maybe. Like is this people incorporating new ideas or is it a battle for ideas? Or morality, really?
You mean morality, broadly speaking?
Yeah,
I think
like how
probably
that
all of
change
the
would come
above. Like
about.
I was just picking a pluralist answer to everything. Uh,
Yeah.
do you all know the Jewish story about the rabbi who keeps saying you're right, I know you're right?
No.
No, please enlighten
To the
us.
husband and the wife. He says, like the husband and wife come in and they're both arguing, and he talks to each of them separately, and they both complain. And he says, "Oh yeah, it sounds like you're definitely right about this." And as they both leave,
Uh-huh.
his assistant says, "Wait, you told them they're both right, but they disagreed." He's like, "Oh, you're right. It's interesting."
Right.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
no, like I think it's all of these things, right? I think that there is synthesis that happens. Like I think that we build on past traditions and we want to see ourselves as building on past traditions, and so there's these narratives of progress that we want to live up to, but there's also like really nasty conflict over this. And like, I think we're seeing it play out right now in America, right, where you're having this 100 years ongoing moral panic conflict over what is essentially morality about who gets to be here, who gets to be a person, who gets to have equal status, who gets to have power, who has to be respected and have dignity in what kinds of ways and stuff like that, right? And all of that is an ongoing, very active strife. And in that strife, we do see greater insights. Like we see different kinds of insights, at least. Like, I'm not saying, we need war to have understanding, but like, I think you get different insights in those situations, in Letter from Birmingham, a jail or something like that, that then can carry forward in quote unquote peacetime, or in different contexts.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. One thing I wanted to ask, again, sort of back to the objective morality question. Does it matter if people believe in objective morality or not?
Maybe. Like, I don't want to put too much weight on like the social science studies on this stuff right now. I do think there's some evidence to suggest that people who see morality as objective in this kind of way might be more likely to act. Now, I think it's very important to say, I think all of this stuff is true, even if it doesn't change anybody's motivation one whit, right? Like, I think it's true philosophically, but I do also tend to think that it influences behavior, and beyond the like what little sort of studies we have on these kinds of metaphysical, metaethical, psychological questions. I've had a lot of conversations in my time about metaethics, and the number of times people have said, or just normative ethics, where somebody says, oh, well, this really doesn't matter though, because morality is subjective, right? Like, I don't have to take that concern seriously because I think morality is subjective, right? Like, so I do think people really do, when it comes to motivation, skip out on certain moral obligations because they feel like they can just say that doesn't matter to them subjectively, and therefore it's not as big a deal. So I think it closes the door on that. Does it mean that you don't find another window, to like get yourself off the hook? Absolutely not, right? Like, psychologically, human beings are predisposed to hold others more responsible morally than they hold themselves, and I don't think that we're like very good at counteracting that. But I do think it at least closes off one easy avenue for dismissing certain moral obligations.
Yeah. I'm sorry, Aaron. My brain is just you kicked it into high gear, and I'm trying to think about 1,000 different things at once. But well, actually,
No
when we get
worries.
into those questions of like people dismissing morality or dismissing other people's morality, as an atheist, one of the things that still uh, the way we're perceived and to an extent treated is that we're less moral or a threat to morality. So if we start talking about, well, there's an objective morality in the world, how do we address these things that would be slighted against us when religious people go, well, you wouldn't understand, you're an atheist, how can you be moral? How do we address those concerns and that
Right.
perception using this sort of framework?
Yeah, and this is exactly what the workshop that I'm doing with Inner Work is like entirely about, which is there is this persistent immoral atheist stereotype. Traditionally, it's a psychological immorality where it's like we just can't be properly motivated or something to be ethical, but nowadays it's often rebranded as like a meta-ethical. We can't rationally justify our moral beliefs or behavior or something like that. And I will say I don't have I have some evidence about this. So I know, for example, let me bring up the data here. This is from American Atheism. Did a giant survey of American atheists and like studied their marginalization experiences in various kinds of ways. And what they found was, it was like, yeah, over 50%, this is in their youth's breakdown of this thing, over 50% of the youth surveyed somewhat or more strongly agree with the statement, people have told me that I am not a good person because I am a secular or non-religious person. Right. I don't think it's more clear cut than that in
Right.
terms of
Yeah.
like stereotype harm kind of thing. Right. If you heard that with, atheist replaced with black
Yeah.
person, right? Like, everybody
Right.
would
Yes.
rightly
Right.
lose their
Mm.
minds
Yeah.
about something
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
But because it's about a secular person, it's treated as, sure, right? There's a rational explanation for why you feel that way about that person, right? Another interesting data point I just want to, to sort of show how I think there is evidence of harm caused by this stuff. They found that 63% of, I think this is of youth, or maybe all atheists actually in this one, report that they always or mostly conceal their secular identity around their extended family.
Mhm.
Right. So, like, people recognize that they will be treated differently, treated worse, right, because of their atheist beliefs, partly because of this negative stereotype. And so they hide that, which leads to like lower sense of authenticity, greater rates of depression, things like that. Right. So this is absolutely an important thing that we need to push back on. And I think part of the way to do that is not cede meta-ethical ground to the Christians or the religious, right? Like, not take their framing of things like moral objectivity as right. And that can mean things like throwing the Euthyphro dilemma at them, or even if you don't want to come on board with me on the like objective morality thing, there's a really, really great debate between Shelley Kagan, who is a top shelf ethics philosopher, right, and William Lane Craig, who is William Lane Craig, right?
It's like a
And
frequent Christian debater, it seems.
yeah, he's one of the people who's most commonly, he likes to argue that the Euthyphro dilemma doesn't actually work against Christians, and his response is terrible. I don't know how much you want to go down the
And this
weeds
is the
on that,
dilemma that
but like
it's
Shelley
we
Kagan.
don't know. We can't say if
Mhm.
something is good because God says it's good, or if it is good and God is just enforcing it, right?
Right. Is it that God's will makes it good, or does God merely correctly recognize that it is good? Right. And what Christians, I think, have to say ultimately, well, so, what they have traditionally said, right, is that like God's will makes it good. And then you ask, how is that not arbitrary? How does that not lead to like petty tyranny? And they say, well, God's will is perfect in such a way where he couldn't choose wrong, right? Like he couldn't choose to make slavery immoral or something. But that just pushes the
Yeah,
regress back
right.
one step,
Yes.
right? You can
Yeah.
ask, right, what is it about, the universe that constrains God's will in such a way where he can't do this particular thing? It's not conceptually impossible. So like what's preventing him? And so yeah, I think that is one good way to push back on them. But I wanted to say, the reason I bring up the Shelley one is that like, Kagan disagrees with me about meta ethics. I think, at present, the point of that debate, he was an anti-realist in the sense that, or he was a subjectivist at least, right? Like, and that I can distinguish between those if you want to, but like, basically the idea is, he thinks that it is our moral intuitions and judgments that make things moral or not, right? I think would be the way that he would put it. I don't want to put too many words in his mouth, but like basically he's kind of constructivist, right? He thinks that we construct the moral understanding, the moral truth from our subjective experiences and things like that. But he still has much better answers to any of the questions in the debate than like William Lane Craig when it comes to both normative and meta ethical issues. And he does a beautiful job of showing that you can like, as much as I think is possible, justify all of those things from a subjective perspective. Now, I think it's still better to justify them from an objective perspective. But if you don't want to go there, I still want, and like I do find that atheists and non-believers are anxious about going there because of their experiences of being oppressed by objective religious arguments, right? Like we're used to seeing this as a tool of tyranny, and so we're very anxious about buying into this. But I think we should take it back. I think we should point out that like Socrates was doing secular ethics thousands of years ago, like before Jesus, right? Like, so there is a secular tradition of ethics that is ancient and it is meaningful, and you can find versions of it in other wisdom traditions. Sometimes it's tied to religion in places like Buddhism, or less so in places, like, well, I would still say somewhat in places like Confucianism, right? But like you still see all of these ethical traditions that are doing hard philosophical work that like it seeks to explain why something is immoral in a more robust way than because God says so.
Mm. Yeah, I feel like that's somewhat my own maybe previous hesitation, I guess, about the objective morality is that it almost seems like, yeah, it's more
Mhm.
like you need to kind of posit a god or something to make it to get there, I guess. But I mean, I guess it's not necessary as you say.
I'll just
Yeah.
add one thing on that. I mean, like, one other argument that I think as naturalists, as science-y kind of people, that like non-believers tend to slide in that direction, right? One other argument that I think they get worried about is this, what Mackey called the argument from queerness, right? The idea that like it's just weird, this idea that there could be to be doneness or to be avoidedness, or like these moral properties hanging out there in the world outside of our minds, right? Like when you were asking earlier about like, are these things outside of our minds? Some people are like, that's just weird. Like if God's not putting them there,
Yeah.
how can they
Yeah.
be there, right? And I think what we just have to do is accept that it's not that weird, right? That it's no weirder than there being a speed of light that we can comprehend or something like that, right? That there could be these normative truths, because and like if there's a weirdness, I would locate the weirdness in the weirdness of consciousness,
Right,
right?
right.
And like the reality of phenomenal consciousness. There are potential moral foundations that don't necessarily have to do with conscious beings, but I think we can all at least agree on the moral foundations that exist in relation to conscious beings. And consciousness is weird. Like there's this subjective objective divide in our reality that we don't yet know how to resolve. We have this hard problem of consciousness that persists, and yet, I think there are plenty of non-believers out there who are okay with saying that phenomenal consciousness exists. And if you're okay with that weirdness, then I think you can't not let normativity in the door with it, because those phenomenal states have a like a value laden nature to them, right? If the experience of suffering has to be avoidedness built into it, there's no other way to describe
Mm,
suffering, I
Mm.
think.
mm. So there's one last thing I'd like to ask, and it may not be easy to resolve, but
Hmm.
having disagreements over this, what does that
Hmm.
tell us about the nature of morality, and how can it lead to resolution? Do we because if we're the subjectivity
Hmm.
of it,
Hmm.
the experience of it, when we find that conflict between two different views that both posit objective morality, how do we
Hmm.
see our way through it?
Yeah, good. So this is Mackey's other argument besides queerness, right? There's the argument for moral disagreement. And I think we can so first thing I will say is some people make the argument, the stronger claim, that because there's moral disagreement, we can know that there is not objective moral truth. And they do this in a kind of like simplistic sense of like, if there are these objective moral truths, we would have to converge on them. And if we're not converging on them, then like they clearly don't exist or something like that, right? And there you could either push back by saying, well, we have converged on them in the ways that like we've talked about here, right? Or you could point out that like people think that like we're all fairly, everyone in this room is fairly confident that the earth is a specific shape, right? But there is persistent disagreement between people about whether the earth is flat or not, right? But we don't think that that persistent disagreement proves that the earth is actually subjective in its shape or something like that, right? Like there's a fact of the matter, and some people are wrong about it. So on that level, I don't think the argument does anything. But as a pluralist, I do believe, because there are these competing moral foundations, there isn't always one right equation for how you balance them at the end of the day, right? So you and I might have a disagreement about how we want to balance respect for individual persons versus the greater good or something like that, right? And I want to introduce vaccine mandates and you don't, right? Or something like that, right? You want to have strong encouragement, but you're afraid of going as far as mandates, right? I think in some situations, maybe not that one,
Right.
right? But in some
Uh,
situations, there can be multiple
Mm,
right
mm.
answers, right? What is the acceptable balance? There, different people can come to different conclusions and both be right. Now there's a range of
yeah.
wrong
Right,
answers,
right.
right? There are things out there where if you sacrifice too much autonomy, you have moved into the wrongness kind of territory or something like that. But those boundaries are hard to pin down, and like a lot of this is intuitive work, and again, we're doing the best we can, right? But I do think some amount of disagreement is unavoidable, not just because we don't always all converge on the truth, but because there are a plurality of acceptable truths in certain
Mm.
situations.
Yeah, I think that, yeah, that makes sense. And I think it just a sort of a question I had, but I think it anticipates it in some way. Like I was just thinking about very trivial things like, what am I going to eat today or
Mm-hmm.
something? And then it's like, do I go for something that's okay, it's like with an animal product, or do I go for something that's, not made with animal products, but maybe it had to be shipped from far away and that contributes like carbon emissions and that causes climate change. And so
Mm-hmm.
like,
Mm-hmm.
is there for
Right.
every decision you make, no matter how minor, like it could nonetheless have some kind of moral implication. And then like,
Mm-hmm.
is there a right answer to all those, like a sort of objectively true right answer in every case? Like, what should I have for breakfast or something like that? I mean, but I think, yeah, yeah.
Right. They're objectively like better and worse
Mhm. Right.
answers, right? Like you
Yes.
shouldn't have the eggs of a rare endangered bird
Right.
for your
Okay.
breakfast or something like
Uh-huh.
that, right? And like maybe you shouldn't have, eggs because like factory farm chickens are horribly mistreated or something like that. And like maybe you should get special eggs from local or something. Like you have an obligation to go and get ethically sourced eggs or something like that. Like there are different ways that you can reconcile these approaches, and it's worth noting like there are some folks who are going to disagree with my approach because they're going to say it's too permissive, right? It makes it too easy for folks to beg off of one moral obligation by citing one foundation in one case and beg off another moral obligation. It doesn't, have potentially enough teeth to it or something like that. And like there, I think if you're going to have a hope of being ethical, it's because you're going to get habituated into it by like people who are ethical and who teach you to care about ethics and to value it and to try to do the right thing or something like that. And I'm sympathetic to Nagel's view that in the absence of genuinely caring about morality for morality's sake, there really aren't very good alternatives. Like you can bribe people a little bit to change their behavior, but like mostly at the end of the day, I don't think it's that we reason people into acting ethically. I think it's that we habituate people into acting ethically and we give them reasons, various different kinds of ethical understanding, which hopefully makes them more sophisticated at doing the right thing, right? They don't sort of ham hand it quite so much.
But that brings that sounds much more like an ethical prescription rather than something strictly moral.
So I don't make a distinction between the terms moral and ethical. Some people do. There's some debates about it. I don't think there's a valuable distinction to like be had there. Commonly, like one distinction is like morality is more like our moral intuitions or our cultural understanding, whereas ethics is like a formulated rule system or something like that. Um, but I think all of it really falls under the same umbrella, and like it all has implications, and like all is interconnected. So I'm not sure that I see, but like I'm curious, is there a meaningful distinction there
Yeah,
for
I
you personally?
typically think about morality in terms of that defines good and evil, and ethics is more of virtue ethics. So it decides the distance
Mm.
between the two vices, right? Where you're
Uh-huh.
what are the trade-offs and
Uh-huh.
how you behave in a way that minimizes bad and produces something that's the most effective.
Yeah, I think part of the reason I don't use them distinctly is because I think everybody has these
Yeah,
different
Mhm.
distinctions. So I've heard
Yeah,
like
right.
10
That,
different
yeah, I
versions of
know.
like how to distinguish between these terms. And so it's just I just
Yeah,
want you to just tell me like every time when I'm having a conversation,
yeah,
what do
yeah.
these words mean for you so I can talk to you in this kind of way.
Philosophers and establishing the terms right first thing out of the gate.
yeah.
Well, maybe Aaron. How about let me try it in a different way, and think about
Okay.
it in terms of um, what this looks like in practice. If it has any practice, it may not. Is there like, do you
Okay.
ever find yourself working out the morality of daily actions, and how do you what informs your decision making process?
So, I mean, I don't think that like we often. So, like I gave that example earlier. We'll sort of beg off an obligation because they see it as subjective. I don't necessarily have a experience like a phenomenal experience of like, oh, this is an objective obligation, so I really got to do it or something like that. But like my we haven't talked about free will here. That's a whole separate conversation. But my free will beliefs are so, fucked at this point that like my understanding of my own motivations are just a giant weird mess. So it's not useful for me to talk about that in relation to like other human beings. I feel like at this point, I feel like Mal in Firefly when he says like, you realize something, you have an ethical obligation, you have a choice, and he's like, I don't think you actually do. I don't experience like having a choice. Like either I do the right thing because I recognize that it is the right thing, or I fail to do so. But like, sorry, I feel like I
No, but
may
I
didn't
think
quite
that
fully answer your
also
question
that
there.
I think speaks to a part of it, and like how we can see this in our daily life. And like whereas in ethos is normally a practice, the morality
Right.
is those are either rules that we're told or informed socially, like that was what you did was bad, what you did was good. But that idea, the way you describe it as like, I go through life, I don't feel like there's not much volition, there's not much choice. But when you reflect on it, you can start to see what was good and what was bad.
Yeah, I think the objective stuff can have implications for things like intervention. Like, do you get involved when somebody else is acting immorally? I think you have a stronger argument for getting involved if you think that morality is objective than if you think it's subjective or culturally relative or something like that, right? Like, if you really think that other cultures just have a different ethical framework and they're acting ethically when they choose to do something that seems deeply immoral to you, then like you have you have less reason to like get involved, right? That seems pretty straightforward to me. So I do think there are implications like that, and those scale down to like in your personal life. If you have a friend who is doing something immoral, do you get involved? Do you stay friends with them? Do you like how do you just like go along with it because like, well, that's their morality and you have your own morality or something. So I do think it can have those kinds of implications in our day-to-day lives. But I also think that it can have implications in the realm of the stuff we were talking about with like the immoral atheist stuff, where like if you have spent some time arguing about ethics normatively, meta-ethically, this sort of thing, and somebody comes at you with like oh, you can't be moral because you're an atheist or something, I think you are a little bit more protected from it. Like I think psychologically you're a little bit more armored and shielded, and you don't get rattled quite so much. You might not feel like you have to alter your behavior quite as much in order to cope with how they made you feel.
Yeah, that's important. But hey, as long as we're passing judgment, and it's important to do, we've got Nathan. Can you set up Can a True Atheist for
Yes.
Aaron?
Yeah. We have a
Ooh.
lightning round sort of game. I guess it's a game.
Ooh.
Yes.
I love a good enlightening round.
It's called Can a True Atheist, and it's sort of about, it's totally tongue-in-cheek. Can a true atheist do such and such? And if they do or don't do that thing, like, you sort of remove their atheist card from them.
Okay.
So the first question, can a true atheist wish that God was real?
Yes.
With this, you can add
Yeah, you can.
explanation notes. You can
Oh, I'm allowed to actually talk about
absolutely.
it.
It's not like those other podcasts.
Yeah.
Those other podcasts where they just kind of trick you.
The ones that just torture people.
You just railroad them. We're not like that.
Just get you canceled. Yeah, no, I mean, I like part of the issue here is going to be like my definition for a true atheist is probably going to be fairly permissive. Like, I think you can do a lot of things, and as long as you also just believe that like God doesn't exist and that like some related moral obligations potentially, then you're a true atheist in my book, right? Like, so, but yeah, I think you as an atheist, like, for example, my uncle is a true atheist who wishes that he believed in God because he sees that his friends seem more chill and happy when they believe in God, even though I think he's just deluding himself.
Okay. Can a true atheist believe humans are special?
Special. I would recommend against it. I mean, like you can, but I wouldn't suggest doing it, I guess I would say, right? You can still count, like you could think that they're special because they have rationality in a way that no other species does, right? Like our friend Kant, who is a great ethicist but also a raging racist, right? And thinks that like certain people aren't real persons. So like you could, but I would say it's better to think that like lots of things are like special in various kinds of ways, and that like humans are not like uniquely special in some way that gives us massive intrinsic value over all other things.
Okay. Can a true atheist put up a Christmas tree?
I hope so, because we're probably gonna do one this year. We usually do one. Yeah. I was, even though I was raised sort of Unitarian Universalist, very non-believing, like we certainly had trees and did this sort of thing. And part of it is that like my wife just really loves like flashy lights. And so we celebrate the flashy light holiday. But like, it's a symbol that predates the Christians substantially, and like take it back, right? Like take it all back. Don't let the Christians, don't let people take away any of your ability to do any sort of silly or festive activity just because someone else is associated with it with their religion.
That's yes, absolutely. That sounds perfect. The war on Christmas is over, and we won. We won a long time ago.
Right.
That's it.
That's right. Yep. We've annexed Christmas.
It's our day. We got trees and reindeer and a fat guy in a suit. It's awesome.
Halloween needs more room to expand anyway. It's
fine. Aaron, we could be here all night. Okay, next one. Can a true atheist date someone who is religious?
Yes. I mean, my first wife was religious. My first wife went to seminary. I'll give you that one even. Yeah, it didn't work out, probably in part because like I don't believe in Jesus. So yeah, I do think you absolutely can. And now you might have some challenges, right? Like it might not make things easier, but like what relationship doesn't have challenges, right? And people have, dated across religious lines for thousands of years, and so they can date across, non-believer lines too, for sure.
Yeah. Can a true atheist say "bless you" if someone sneezes?
Yes, though I prefer Gesundheit. Right. I don't think you have to do the "nothing happens when you die" thing.
I've never heard that.
Yeah. No, that's it. I think it's a Dane Cook one or something.
You say that like you say that after someone sneezes.
Yes, right. What do atheists say after someone sneezes? Nothing happens when you die. No, I think you can say "bless you." You can say Gesundheit. Stop it. You need a tissue. Generally speaking, I'm not super fussed about most colloquialisms. I would say when it comes to these sort of things.
Well, here's another one then. Can a true atheist believe religion does good in the world?
Yeah, I think it would be weird. So, like, if you mean, do they do net good? That's a much harder question. But, like, if you mean, like, do they do some good? Yes. Like, there's just an endless number of examples of people, like, for religious reasons and in relation to religious organizations doing a bunch of good and stuff, right? I do worry that the answer on the net question is no, that, like, overall it causes more harm than good, partly because it requires people to invest their identities in something fictional, which is not a stable or good foundation for their identity. And while I've known and know many, many of my best friends are Christians, right? And they like do ethical things and like do them because of Jesus sometimes. I think, and I wouldn't want to ever take that away from them. At the same time, right, if I could Thanos, snap the universe into a place where no one ever remembered that they had religion, but they had all the good secular moral alternatives, that would seem preferable.
Can a true atheist be a moral relativist?
Yes, though I would say you shouldn't, right? Obviously, but like you technically can, right? You can be an anti-realist. You can be. I don't know if there's any other than like divine command theory. I'm not sure there's any other moral meta-ethical views that like you couldn't buy into and still be qualifying as an atheist.
And finally, can a true atheist be immoral?
Yes, frequently. Speaking from personal experience. Yes, it's quite possible, right? I think I don't think there's any evidence that we are more immoral. I actually do worry. I'm curious to try to see if I can come up with more evidence about the possibility that there's a kind of stereotype threat where the fact that we are perceived as immoral. So, for example, I've heard many anecdotal stories. Obviously, like I need several hundred more anecdotes for it to qualify as
Right.
data,
Right.
right? But at present, right? Like I've heard many people who've said, you know, they came from a religious background, as like something like 60 or 70% of atheists do, right? And when they left their religious experiences, positions, they had a kind of moral crisis, right? An existential crisis. And like they didn't know where meaning comes from for them, or where ethics comes from potentially. Not everybody goes through this, but like some people do. And some of them, I think, respond to it by going through a period of like hedonism or like pushback or something like that, or like they feel the need to like lean into the kind of immoral stereotype and do immoral things that they might then later regret as sort of proving themselves or living their life or something like that, right? So I think that's something that I worry about and I'm concerned about, and I want to get to those people before they feel compelled to do anything performative that they don't really want to do, and like help them see that like you can still have plenty of morality and you can have as much fun as you want, but like do it for the right reasons,
Yeah.
kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's not
That makes sense.
It's not like a Rumspringa.
I mean, have a little Rumspringa if you want, but like don't do it because you're then gonna go back to your weird cult or
because
something like that,
that's
right?
what you were
Like,
told you are.
right. Do it because it feels right and you want to do
Right.
it.
There we go.
And you're not hurting
Yeah.
anybody.
Mitigate the suffering or eliminate it.
Right. Respect other people's autonomy, et cetera, et cetera. All the foundations.
That makes it sound so easy.
I know, it's incredibly hard. Like ethics' job is you show up with a problem and I make it worse. Like that's like
Right.
70, 80, maybe 90% of my job is like, oh, you think you got a problem there? Let me
Right.
add some dimensions
Yeah.
to it for
Right.
you.
Yeah.
Oh, you want solutions? Here's like 5 different solutions. Which one's the best one? I don't know.
Yeah.
They're all bad. Like they're just
Yeah.
different degrees of bad. Like, yeah.
And so if
This is why my show involves the void.
exactly. So, and if people want more of this, how do they find you, Aaron? Where can they go?
Yeah, so the podcasts are Embrace the Void, where it's, me talking to all sorts of different kinds of people, politics, philosophy, culture war, all sorts of stuff like this. And then Philosophers in Space, where it's me and Thomas Smith talking about science fiction and its relationships to philosophy. They are both hopefully accessible for non-philosophers. You can also find me on Twitter at ETVPod. And come to, if you're on Facebook, come join the Philosophers in Space Facebook group. It is one of the chillest, nicest places on the internet to have fun and not deal with trolls.
Yeah, and you should plug your workshop too one more time.
Oh yeah, and the workshop is let me bring up the info, and I
It'll
can
be linked below.
share the link. So yeah, it's called Morality Without God. It's through Inner Work. It's a virtual workshop. It's 3 Saturdays in a row, starting on January the 8th, from 10 a.m. to 11:30 Eastern Standard Time. And we're going to talk about people's experiences. We're going to talk about some of the stuff we've talked about here tonight, and things that work for folks. It's my first time doing it in this format, so I'm really excited to explore it in sort of a non-giving a talk kind of format.
Yeah. It sounds great. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks so much, Aaron. Like this is great. So rich, I guess. I mean, so much to think about. Yeah.
So much gishkalop. I know. No, I appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun. This is obviously, one of my favorite hobby horses, so I love to ride it around for a while.
Right.
Well, yeah, we're glad you rode it around here.
So that was Aaron Rabinowitz. That was a lot of fun talking with him. Todd, what did you take away from that one?
Well, the big picture thing I took away is that it reminded me a lot of the conversation we had with Dr. Carol Wayne White about religious naturalism, which you can go back and listen to that one. She brings up a lot of the same ideas, which is like we are part of this natural universe. We learn from the natural universe, And by following the natural universe, we should be able to determine the difference between right and wrong. Right? I mean, is that part of what you took away from it?
Yeah, I think about the issue of like combining various perspectives, combining reasoning with sort of experience and so on. I think in general, like I like sort of the pluralist approach to like morality. Um, I think like my initial hang up sort of on the idea of like objective morality was the idea that like for every, like I was saying, like for every minor decision, that there would have to be some kind of like ultimate right answer that was like sort of existed outside of us. But that doesn't doesn't necessarily have to be the case.
I think
um
he's saying it does. It's just that we don't necessarily know it yet.
yeah, or that there could be multiple right answers, I guess.
Yeah, that's
um
that's true. The
mhm.
yeah, the philosopher's hedge.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
think
uh,
him moving you away from utilitarianism, this is a big change. This is a swing. I'll take this. It's a
I
nice
mean,
move.
I think it's, I mean, I feel like, again, like the sort of the pluralist thing, like which I really didn't know about before. I thought it was like, the idea of like utilitarianism was contradictory or whatever with the deontological ethics. But I mean, I guess they could be seen as like complementary approaches, perhaps. I mean, I think like obviously there's a lot of insights in utilitarianism, and I mean, yeah, and also in the deontology. So yeah, I mean, I guess it's like take. I don't know. I mean, maybe some proponents of those particular schools would disagree with combining them, but yeah, perhaps it's legitimate to take from all of them, like whatever you. Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Is
Not
it
sure if
going
that's.
to is it going to change the way you behave?
No, I don't think so. Yeah, I mean, I think that's one interesting thing, which we could have maybe gone to a little bit more, but like how, even in general, how like philosophical writings about morality impact everyday life, or like impact society or something. And I think like you could definitely point to utilitarian writings and point to all sorts of ways that these have maybe informed society and like laws and whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, actually, I should have brought this up earlier. There's a bunch of stuff coming out now because I think it's the anniversary of the publication of John Rawls' Theory of Justice.
Okay. Uh-huh.
So I think it just hit 50 years, maybe 60 years. Um, and that one, yeah. So there are think pieces dribbling out here and there about how influential that has become, and that was part of the sort of transmission belt that Aaron laid out, is that like some of what we know comes from philosophy, um, and that's how we learn these things, right? That like there's now, if we take this seriously, it sounds like there is a project of human learning where you acquire a stock of knowledge about the moral character of the universe, right? And you use that to objectively understand what is appropriate behavior. But I think the flip side of this is, even if we just strip this of all the philosophy, and it's the same that we can do with religious naturalism, the idea of that saying like we as humans have learned over time the difference between right and wrong is a pretty fucking basic statement. And the great thing about it is it's completely divorced from religious doctrine, right? And he brought it up later, talking about how the way atheists are perceived as being less moral, it's really something that we need to teach ourselves and reinforce among ourselves, is that we treat morality seriously and we treat it the way all humans have across time, and not in some ridiculous, silly, just so story that gets pounded into our heads. The way people have determined what's right and wrong is by living lives and reflecting on it, right? Like there's absolutely, you know, course, Aaron's absolutely right that like we've learned right from wrong from how we lived in the world. Um, and this does not come from a divine source, right? We should be proud of this. We should be proud that we know the difference between right and wrong without having some space tyrant spying on us 24 hours a day. Like, we need to turn that around. There used to be, so I've really got to find better literature on this, but there used to be, I guess, we go back 500 years before the conquest of the New World. There were kind of two ideas of how people learned about God. There was like the gospel of the book and the gospel of the world. The concept being like, well, look, you can't. There are plenty of places where people have never read a Bible or heard about Jesus, but that's not their fault, right? But they should have come to the conclusion that God loves them and wants them to do well and wants them to behave in these prescribed manners. You should be able to figure that out from living in the world, right? Like, yeah, of course you help someone out if their house burns down. Of course you help out other people. Of course you take care of your family. Of course you give alms to the poor, whatever it is, right? All of this should be obvious because you live in the world. That only became a problem during the industrial age when people started studying the land and saying, well, it's not 6,000 years old, and there are these giant dinosaurs, and people used to live in caves. That it doesn't conform to the Bible, that the two aren't the same. So then this sort of the gulf between science and religion started to become evident. And one of this to me points to one of the consequences of that is that we've lost sight of where our morality really came from. It didn't come from tablets that were handed down.
Yeah. And I think one interesting thing he was saying is that like if there were a God, the problem would not of morality would not go away. If anything, it would
Yeah.
get more complicated. I think
Right.
that's a really good point. I mean, yeah, one might like wish there were just divine answers to every moral question, but then it's actually not a good thing to wish for, because it could be a case like um yeah, it could be a universe where there's a god who says like enslaving people is a good thing to do or something like that, and that would be a
Which
horrible
he
universe.
says.
Yeah,
It happens
right,
all the
it's true.
time.
Yeah, right. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, so yeah, and that would be a bad universe to live in. So we're fortunate in that way, that we don't live in that universe. Yeah, and I think just another thing is, I mean, it's interesting that like it seems different societies have like independently hit on the same kind of moral rules, like the golden rule, for example. I guess is sort of discovered multiple times independently. Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's something to that fact. There is like a objective moral standard maybe that we have access to through reasoning and experience and so on.
Yeah, and that, I mean, that it gets interpreted in so many different ways about how we ought to behave and what we even mean by morality. I think it also points to other places we should look further. I don't think we haven't gone backwards. We should think about that, like what happened before human morality, animal
Mm-hmm.
morality, even.
Yeah, right, yes. Yeah, that's yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Also, I mean, with this one, this is one where it's a fun feeling, and it's been rare, except when listening to this show, to feel your brain get kicked into gear like this and just start
Yeah,
that
yeah.
thought process. Even if it's spinning in 20 different directions, there's certain joy in that. So I'm super thankful for Aaron for coming on. For It's so much food for thought. It's really fantastic. That's always good. What else? Oh yeah, how do we, Nathan? Offhand, do you know where our listeners can find Aaron's other work?
Well, he's got that workshop coming up. It's called Morality Without God, and it's running in January for 3 weeks. And then we'll add a link below if you want to sign up for it, for more, I guess, like similar sorts of stuff like we were talking about today. And so definitely people should check that out and check out his podcasts.
Yeah, the
Um,
two, and they are Embrace the Void
And
And
Philosophers in Space. Yes,
Philosophers in
in Space.
Space.
Yes. Yeah.
Fantastic. When do they get to ride the Blue Origin rocket?
Right. Yeah.
Why are they never
Yeah. Right.
going up?
Yeah. Right. I know.
Oh, actors and sports stars and
Hmm. Yeah.
scientists. Not
Yeah.
why.
Yeah.
We need some philosophers up
Yeah.
there.
Right.
Kill
Yeah.
them. All right. Yeah. Big thanks to the listeners. Thank you guys so much. Appreciate all your feedback and love. And especially to our patrons, Lars and Debbie. Thank you guys for making this show possible. Nathan, anyone else you want to thank?
I want to thank Red Japan, who supplies the theme music.
They left hours ago.
Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
not even around.
Mhm.
They're not paying
Yeah.
attention.
No.
And what else do we have to do? Anything else? Nathan, you got anything else going on?
No. Just to like and subscribe, rate and review, and so on. Yeah.
Smash that button.
Yes.
Pull the string.
Yes. Mhm.
And no shame in putting up a Christmas tree.
Right.
Reclaim
Yeah,
the
that's true.
holiday.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
ours.
Right.
We did it. We won the war.
Yeah.
It's just we can wave high the banner. It's fantastic. It feels good. Yeah, that's it. It was real. Thanks everybody for
Yes.
listening.
Yes.
See you again next time.